Hello, and welcome to my channel. My name is ShadowScript. Tonight, I'll be sharing horror stories from different states across America, each one darker, deeper, and more haunting than the last. So find a quiet place, let the rain calm your thoughts, and drift slowly into the shadows. Our first destination is West Virginia. This is the curse of Flatwoods Hollow. The fog rolled thick through Flatwoods Hollow like the breath of something ancient and malevolent. Sarah Mitchell pulled her hiking jacket tighter as she followed the narrow trail, her flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive darkness that had fallen far too early for an October evening. "This place gives me the creeps," muttered Jake, her boyfriend, as branches seemed to reach out like skeletal fingers from the surrounding trees. "Why did we have to come here of all places?" Behind them, their friends Marcus and Lisa whispered nervously about the local legends. Every local in Braxton County knew about the Flatwoods Monster, the 10-foot-tall creature with glowing red eyes that had terrorized the area since 1952. But Sarah was a skeptic, a graduate student in folklore from West Virginia University, and she was determined to document the truth behind the legend. The trail wound deeper into the hollow, where the trees grew so thick that even daylight struggled to penetrate. Ancient oaks and maples twisted together overhead, their branches forming a canopy so dense it felt like walking through a living tunnel. The air grew colder with each step, and an unnatural silence settled over the group. "Did you hear that?" Lisa whispered suddenly, grabbing Marcus's arm. They all stopped, straining to listen. From somewhere ahead came a low, mechanical whirring sound, like metal grinding against metal. Sarah's heart began to race despite her rational mind trying to explain it away. "Probably just a generator," Jake said, but his voice lacked conviction. The sound grew louder as they continued, accompanied now by an acrid smell that burned their nostrils. The fog seemed to pulse with an eerie green light, and Sarah noticed that their electronic devices were beginning to malfunction. Her GPS unit displayed impossible coordinates, and Jake's phone screen flickered with strange symbols. "West Virginia has a lot of old mining equipment," Sarah said, more to convince herself than the others. "That's probably what we're hearing." But as they rounded a bend in the trail, they saw the source of the disturbance. In a clearing ahead, a massive shape loomed through the fog. It stood at least 10 feet tall, with a spade-shaped head that seemed to float above a dark, flowing body. Two crimson eyes blazed like coals in the darkness, and when it moved, that terrible mechanical whirring filled the air. "The Flatwoods Monster," Marcus breathed, his voice barely audible. The creature turned toward them, and Sarah felt a primal terror that went beyond rational fear. This was something that didn't belong in their world, something that violated the natural order simply by existing. The red eyes fixed on their group, and a hissing sound emerged from the darkness beneath that alien head. "Run," Sarah whispered. Then louder, "Run." They scattered down the trail, crashing through underbrush and leaping over fallen logs. Behind them, the mechanical whirring grew louder, accompanied by a sound like rushing wind. Sarah risked a glance back and saw the creature gliding between the trees, its form shifting and changing as if it wasn't entirely solid. But as they fled deeper into Flatwoods Hollow, they realized they had made a terrible mistake. The trail they were following wasn't the same one they had entered on. The trees here were older, more twisted, and the very air seemed to thicken with malevolent energy. "Where are we?" Lisa gasped, her face pale with exhaustion and terror. Sarah checked her compass, but the needle spun wildly. "I don't know. Nothing makes sense." That's when they heard it. A sound that made the Flatwoods Monster's mechanical whirring seem almost comforting in comparison. From somewhere deep in the hollow came a low, resonant humming that seemed to vibrate through the earth itself. It was a sound that spoke of immense age and unspeakable hunger. "That's not the monster," Jake said, his voice tight with fear. "That's something else." The fog began to swirl in patterns that hurt to look at directly, and shapes moved within it. Shapes that had never been human. Sarah realized with growing horror they had stumbled into something far older and more dangerous than the Flatwoods Monster. They had awakened something that had been sleeping in the depths of the hollow for centuries, perhaps millennia. The humming grew louder, and the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. Trees creaked and groaned as if the very forest was alive and angry. From the darkness ahead came the sound of massive footsteps, each one shaking the earth. The stories, Sarah whispered, pieces of local folklore suddenly clicking into place. The Native Americans who lived here before the settlers, they said this hollow was cursed. They called it the place of endless hunger. Whatever was approaching was far larger than the Flatwoods monster, and infinitely more ancient. The fog parted like curtains, and they caught glimpses of something that defied description. A mass of writhing shadows and gleaming eyes. A creature that seemed to exist in more dimensions than the human mind could comprehend. "We have to get out of here," Marcus said, his voice cracking. "Now." But as they turned to flee, they found their path blocked by the Flatwoods monster itself. Up close, it was even more terrifying. A being that seemed to be part machine, part living darkness. Its red eyes burned with alien intelligence, and when it spoke, its voice was like the sound of grinding gears. "You should not have come here," it said in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "You have disturbed the old one. What do you want?" Sarah managed to ask, though every instinct screamed at her to run. "I am the guardian," the creature replied. "For 70 years, I have kept the old one sleeping. But your presence here, your fear, your life force, it has awakened what should never wake." The humming behind them grew deafening, and Sarah felt something vast and terrible approaching. The Flatwoods monster turned its burning gaze toward the deeper darkness. "Run," it said simply. "Run while you still can." They didn't need to be told twice. As the earth shook and the trees began to wither and die around them, the four friends ran through the fog-shrouded hollow. Behind them, they could hear the sounds of a battle between forces beyond human comprehension. The mechanical whirring of the Flatwoods monster mixed with roars that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth. Somehow, miraculously, they found the original trail. Sarah's GPS unit suddenly began working again, showing them the way back to their car. They ran without stopping, not daring to look back, until they reached the safety of the main road. It wasn't until they were miles away that they finally stopped to catch their breath. In the distance, they could see strange lights flickering over Flatwoods Hollow, and the fog seemed to glow with an unnatural phosphorescence. "What was that thing?" Lisa asked, her voice shaking. "The one in the deeper part of the hollow." Sarah shook her head. "I don't know, but I think the Flatwoods monster, whatever it really is, has been protecting us from something much worse all these years." They never spoke of what they had seen in Flatwoods Hollow, but sometimes, on particularly dark nights, they could hear that ancient humming in their dreams. And Sarah, despite her academic training, never again questioned the wisdom of local legends, because some stories, she learned, are warnings, and some monsters are the only things standing between us and something infinitely worse. The fog still rolls through Flatwoods Hollow on certain nights, and the locals still report seeing the red-eyed creature gliding between the trees. But they no longer fear it quite as much as they once did. They know now that it's not the real monster. It's the guardian keeping the real monster asleep. And as long as it continues its eternal vigil, the old one will remain buried in the depths of the hollow, dreaming its terrible dreams. But every year, the humming grows a little louder, and the Flatwoods monster's red eyes burn a little dimmer. Time, after all, defeats even the most dedicated guardian. And when it finally falls, the people of West Virginia will discover what true horror really means. The morning mist clung to the cypress trees like ghostly fingers as Dr. Sarah Chen adjusted her research equipment along the banks of Bayou Noir. The water stretched endlessly into the heart of the Louisiana swamplands, its surface black as obsidian and still as death. She had come here to study the unusual water composition that locals whispered about in hushed tones, but what she would discover would forever change her understanding of the supernatural. "This place gives me the creeps," muttered Jake, her research assistant, as he set up the sampling equipment. The 23-year-old had been complaining since they'd arrived at dawn, but Sarah needed his help to collect water samples from various depths. "It's just a swamp, Jake," Science doesn't believe in ghost stories, Sarah replied, though she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from the dark water. The locals in the nearby town of Marais Noir had warned them about this particular stretch of bayou. Old Marie Boudreau, the town's unofficial historian, had grabbed Sarah's arm with surprising strength and whispered urgent warnings about the curse that plagued these waters. According to her, a powerful voodoo priestess named Celeste Thibodeau had performed a ritual here in 1847 to protect the swamp from encroaching settlers. But something had gone terribly wrong. As Sarah lowered the sampling device into the water, she noticed the temperature gauge dropping rapidly. The water was unnaturally cold, almost freezing, despite the humid Louisiana heat. More disturbing was the way the water seemed to move without any wind or current, forming small whirlpools that appeared and disappeared like breathing. "Dr. Chun, look at this," Jay called out, his voice trembling. He was pointing at their electronic equipment, which had begun malfunctioning. The GPS was spinning wildly. The radio emitted only static, and their phones had lost all signal. That's when they heard it the first whisper. It started as a barely audible sound, like wind through leaves, but gradually became more distinct. The voice was speaking in Creole French, words that seemed to come from the water itself. Sarah, who had studied some French in college, could only make out fragments. "Vini vini, kill you, Landiela? Come come, or are you in the water?" Jake dropped his equipment and stepped backward, his face pale. "We need to leave. Now." But as he spoke, the whispers multiplied. Soon, dozens of voices were calling from beneath the dark surface, each one speaking in different languages: French, English, Spanish, and others Sarah couldn't identify. The voices grew louder, more insistent, and the water began to churn violently. Sarah watched in horror as shapes began to form in the water, translucent figures that seemed to be reaching upward, their mouths open in silent screams. The spirits of those who had been claimed by the cursed bayou were rising, and they were hungry for new souls to join their eternal torment. "The ritual," Sarah whispered, remembering Marie's story. Celeste Thibodeau was trying to bind the spirits of the dead to protect the swamp, but instead she opened a gateway. She trapped them here, and now they're trying to possess anyone who comes near. The water suddenly erupted in a massive splash, and a figure emerged, a woman in tattered 19th century dress, her skin translucent and eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. It was Celeste herself, the voodoo priestess, still bound to the bayou by her failed ritual. "You have disturbed the sacred waters," Celeste's voice echoed across the swamp, speaking in perfect English, despite her obvious French heritage. "Now you must pay the price. Your souls will join us in the eternal dance of the damned." Jake turned to run, but as soon as his foot touched the muddy bank, his eyes rolled back and his body went rigid. When he turned around, his face was no longer his own. Something ancient and malevolent looked out through his eyes, and when he spoke, it was with the voice of someone who had been dead for over a century. "Sarah, sweet Sarah, come into the water with us. It's so cold, so peaceful. You'll never have to worry about anything again." Sarah backed away, her heart pounding. She remembered Marie's final warning. "Don't let the water touch you, child. Once it does, you belong to them forever." But the possessed Jake was advancing on her, and behind him, more figures were emerging from the bayou. Confederate soldiers who had hidden in the swamp during the Civil War, runaway slaves who had sought freedom but found only death, Native Americans who had called this place home long before the Europeans arrived, all of them claimed by the cursed waters, and now serving as instruments of Celeste's twisted magic. Sarah realized that her only chance was to break the ritual that bound the spirits to the bayou. She remembered seeing symbols carved into a large cypress tree when they first arrived, strange markings that she had dismissed as vandalism. Now she understood they were part of Celeste's original spell. Racing through the swamp, dodging the grasping hands of the possessed, Sarah reached the ancient tree. The symbols were carved deep into the bark, and they seemed to pulse with a dark energy. She pulled out her knife and began scraping at the markings, trying to destroy them. The moment she touched the first symbol, the entire swamp erupted in chaos. The spirits wailed in agony. The water boiled and frothed. and the very air seemed to tear apart. Celeste's ghostly form materialized beside the tree, her face twisted in rage. "You cannot destroy what has been written in blood and bone," she hissed. "The curse is eternal." But Sarah noticed something. As she damaged each symbol, some of the spirits began to fade, their faces showing relief rather than anger. They weren't evil, they were trapped, forced to serve Celeste's will against their nature. The voodoo priestess had become corrupted by her own magic, and now she was the true evil that needed to be stopped. "You're not protecting the swamp," Sarah shouted over the supernatural storm. "You're poisoning it. These spirits don't want to hurt people, they want to be free." With desperate strength, Sarah carved through the final symbol. The tree shuddered, and a blinding light erupted from the damaged markings. Celeste's scream echoed across the bayou as her form began to dissolve. "This is not over," she warned as she faded. "The darkness will return. It always returns." The light faded, and the swamp fell silent. Jake collapsed to his knees, his own consciousness restored. The water in the bayou had returned to normal, and the oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the area was gone. As they gathered their equipment and prepared to leave, Sarah noticed something floating in the water near the shore. It was an old leather journal, waterlogged but somehow still intact. Opening it carefully, she found it was Celeste's personal diary, documenting her experiments with voodoo magic and her growing obsession with power. The final entry, dated just before her death, was chilling. "I have found the way to eternal life, but the price is higher than I imagined. The spirits demand more souls, always more. I fear I have made a terrible mistake, but it is too late to turn back. May God forgive me for what I have unleashed upon this sacred place." Sarah closed the journal and looked back at the bayou. The water was calm now, but she knew that somewhere in its depths, the evil was only sleeping, waiting for the right moment to rise again. The curse had been broken, but the darkness that had created it remained, lurking in the shadows of the Louisiana swamplands. As they drove away from Bayou Noir, Sarah made a mental note to return the journal to Marie Boudreau. The old woman would know what to do with it, and perhaps, with the truth finally revealed, the spirits of the bayou could find the peace they had been denied for so long. But late that night, as Sarah sat in her hotel room writing her report, she heard something that made her blood run cold. From the bathroom came the sound of water dripping, even though she had made sure all the taps were turned off. And in that rhythmic dripping, she could swear she heard whispers calling her name, speaking in Creole French, inviting her to return to the dark waters of the bayou. The curse might have been broken, but some things, once awakened, never truly sleep. And in the heart of the Louisiana swamplands, something ancient and hungry was already beginning to stir once more. The endless night had swallowed Nome whole, turning the small Alaskan town into a frozen graveyard where shadows danced without light. For 67 days, the sun had been nothing more than a memory, and with each passing hour, the town's grip on reality grew weaker. Sarah Chin pressed her face against the frost-covered window of the Nome General Store, watching the empty street stretch into darkness. The thermometer outside read -42 degrees, but the cold that seeped through the walls felt different now, alive, hungry, searching. "Another one's gone missing," whispered Tom Erickson, the store owner, his breath forming ghostly clouds in the frigid air. "That makes 7 this week." Sarah turned from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. Who this time? Little Maya Kasayali. Her grandmother found her bed empty this morning, window wide open. No footprints in the snow, no sign of struggle. Just gone. The bell above the door chimed, and both Sarah and Tom jumped. A figure stumbled through the entrance, covered in snow and ice, moving with jerky, unnatural movements. It was James Wright, the town's mail carrier who had vanished 3 days ago. "James," Sarah called out, relief flooding her voice. "Thank God you're alive. We thought." Her words died in her throat as James turned toward them. His eyes were completely black, like twin voids that seemed to absorb the meager light from the store's fluorescent bulbs. His skin had taken on a bluish-gray pallor, and when he smiled, His teeth appeared sharp and jagged. "Sarah," James spoke, but his voice carried an echo, as if multiple voices were speaking in unison. "I've been looking for you." Tom grabbed a baseball bat from behind the counter, his hands shaking violently. "That's not James. That's not our James." James tilted his head at an impossible angle, the bones in his neck audibly cracking. "The darkness has shown me such beautiful things, Sarah. The cold spaces between the stars, where the hungry ones wait. They're coming home now, and they need vessels." Sarah backed toward the rear exit, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "What happened to you, James? What's happening to our town?" "The long night awakens old things," James said, taking a step closer. His feet left wet, black prints on the floor. "Gnome sits on sacred ground, cursed ground. The Inupiat knew to fear the polar night, knew what hunted in the endless dark. But progress made us forget." Tom swung the bat at James, but it passed through him like he was made of smoke. James laughed, a sound like breaking glass mixed with screaming wind. "The children go first," James continued, his form beginning to flicker and fade. "They're easier to reshape, to improve. Maya is beautiful now, Sarah. She's learning to fly in the space between heartbeats." The lights in the store began to flicker, and Sarah could hear something scratching at the walls from the outside. Dozens of small, sharp claws digging into the wood and metal. "The disappeared ones are returning," James whispered, his voice growing fainter. "But they're bringing friends. The shadow people have been waiting so long for an invitation." Sarah ran for the back door, Tom close behind her. They burst into the alley, where the bitter Alaskan wind cut through their clothes like knives. The snow around them began to move, forming shapes that looked almost human, but wrong in every conceivable way. "My truck," Tom gasped, pointing to a vehicle parked nearby. They ran through the shifting snow, the shadows reaching for them with fingers that felt like ice water. As they reached the truck, Sarah looked back at the store. Through the windows, she could see dozens of figures moving inside, the missing townspeople, all with those same black eyes and wrong smiles. And behind them, something vast and dark pressed against the glass, something that had too many arms and breathed with the rhythm of a dying heart. Tom's truck roared to life, and they sped through the empty streets of Nome. But everywhere they looked, windows were filled with watchers, the changed ones, the improved ones, standing motionless as statues and staring out at the frozen world with eyes like bottomless wells. "The community center," Sarah said, her voice barely audible over the engine. "If anyone's still normal, they'd go there." They drove through the maze of ice-covered streets, passing abandoned cars and homes with doors hanging open like screaming mouths. The radio crackled with static, but occasionally voices would break through. Children's voices, singing lullabies in languages that predated human speech. The community center stood dark against the star-filled sky, its windows boarded up from the inside. Tom pounded on the door, shouting for anyone who might be alive inside. "Please, we need help. The things are coming." A small slot in the door opened, revealing a single terrified eye. "How do we know you're still you?" a voice asked. "Because we're scared," Sarah replied. "Because we're still running." The door opened, and they were pulled inside by Reverend Michael Torres and 3 other survivors. The interior was lit by candles and heated by a wood-burning stove, but the warmth felt thin and desperate against the cosmic cold pressing in from all sides. "It started with the power outage," Reverend Torres explained, his voice hollow with exhaustion. 3 weeks ago, when the electricity went out town-wide. That's when the first disappearances began. The children, then the adults. They'd vanish in the night and return, changed. An elderly Inupiat woman named Agnes Kenguk sat in the corner, her weathered hands working at a string of prayer beads. "My great-grandmother told stories," she said quietly, "about the Tunrak, the shadow spirits that hunt in the polar night. She said they were locked away beneath the ice, but that men would one day dig too deep and let them free." "The mining operation," Sarah gasped. "The new copper mine they opened last month." They were digging deeper than anyone had ever gone before. Agnes nodded grimly. The Earth has a memory, and some things are buried for good reason. The company broke through into spaces that should have stayed sealed. Outside, the scratching began again, dozens of claws against the walls, growing louder and more insistent. The candles flickered, and the temperature began to drop rapidly. "They're testing us," Reverend Torres whispered, "seeing if we're weak enough to take." Through the boarded windows, they could see shapes moving in the darkness, the changed townspeople, walking in perfect synchronization toward the community center. Their footsteps made no sound in the snow, and their black eyes reflected the candlelight like mirrors. "The radio," Tom said suddenly. "We need to get to the radio station. Warn the outside world." "No one will believe us," Sarah replied, but she was already moving toward the back door. "But we have to try." They slipped out into the night, leaving the other survivors barricaded inside. The streets of Nome had become a maze of living shadows, where the very darkness seemed to pulse with malevolent intelligence. The changed ones watched from doorways and windows, their presence a constant weight of dread. At the radio station, they found the emergency broadcast system still functional. Sarah grabbed the microphone with trembling hands. "This is Nome, Alaska. We need immediate evacuation. The town is no longer safe. Something has been released from beneath the ice. The missing people are returning, but they're not human anymore. If you can hear this, do not send rescue teams. Contain the area. Do not let it spread." As she spoke, the station's windows began to fog with breath that wasn't coming from inside. Faces appeared in the condensation, the faces of the disappeared, pressing against the glass from the outside. "We see you, Sarah," they spoke in unison, their voices vibrating through the building structure. "We've been waiting for you to join us. The darkness is so beautiful, so peaceful. No more fear, no more cold, no more loneliness." The glass began to crack, spider webbing outward from where the faces pressed against it. Sarah kept broadcasting, her voice growing more desperate with each word. "The things that were imprisoned beneath Nome are loose. They're spreading through the population, changing people into something else. The polar night has awakened them, and they're using our own neighbors and families as vessels. This is not a hoax. This is not a drill." The windows shattered simultaneously, and the changed ones began flowing into the station like a tide of living shadow. Sarah and Tom ran for the transmitter room, locking themselves inside as the creatures pounded against the door. "The broadcast is still going," Tom said, checking the equipment. "Maybe someone will hear it. Maybe someone will understand." Outside the locked door, they could hear the voices of everyone they had ever known and loved in Nome. Friends, neighbors, family members, all speaking in that same hollow, echoing tone about the beauty of the darkness and the peace of surrender. Sarah looked at Tom, seeing her own terror reflected in his eyes. They were the last two normal people left in a town that had become a doorway to something ancient and hungry. "If we don't make it," she said quietly, "if they get us too, at least we tried to warn people." The door began to buckle under the pressure of dozens of hands pushing against it. The changed ones were singing now, a lullaby in that prehistoric language that made the very air vibrate with wrongness. As the door finally gave way, Sarah closed her eyes and made one last broadcast. "This is Sarah Chun in Nome, Alaska. We are the last. The darkness is coming. The polar night never really ends here. It just waits, and now it's spreading. God help us all." The transmission cut to static as the shadows flowed into the room, and Nome settled into a deeper darkness than any polar night had ever brought. But somewhere in the frozen wasteland of Alaska, a signal continued to broadcast, a warning carried on the wind to anyone who might still be listening. In the endless night, the changed ones stood in the streets of Nome, their black eyes turned toward the south, where other towns waited in the cold and the dark, unaware that something ancient had awakened and was slowly, patiently, making its way toward them. The polar night had only just begun. The October wind howled through the skeletal branches of Salem's ancient oaks as paranormal investigator Marcus Kane adjusted his equipment one final time. His YouTube channel, Haunted America, had gained millions of subscribers by exploring the nation's most cursed locations. But tonight would be different. Tonight, he was going live from the most infamous witch trial site in Massachusetts. Welcome back, ghost hunters. Marcus spoke into his camera, his breath forming ghostly clouds in the frigid air. I'm standing in the heart of Salem, just yards from where 20 innocent souls were executed during the witch trials of 1692. Tonight, we're not just investigating, we're attempting to make contact through a live seance. The chat exploded with excitement as viewers from around the world tuned in. Marcus had chosen Halloween night deliberately, believing the veil between worlds would be thinnest. What he didn't know was that some veils should never be lifted. Behind him loomed the weathered headstones of the old burying point, their carved inscriptions barely visible in the flickering candlelight. Marcus had arranged 13 black candles in a perfect circle around a makeshift altar, upon which rested an antique Ouija board he'd acquired from a local antiquities dealer. The energy here is incredible, Marcus whispered, setting up his thermal imaging camera. I can already feel the temperature dropping. The device confirmed his suspicions. The air around the altar had plummeted to nearly freezing, while the surrounding area remained a comfortable 50 degrees. As he began the seance ritual, Marcus noticed something peculiar about the Ouija board. It would appeared much older than the dealer had claimed, with strange symbols carved along its edges. The planchette, made of what looked like blackened bone, seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. Spirits of Salem, Marcus called out, his voice echoing across the cemetery. We invite you to communicate with us. We mean no harm. We seek only to understand your story. The candles flickered despite the absence of wind. The chat erupted with comments about orbs appearing on camera, but Marcus was too focused on the board to notice. The planchette began to move, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency. BRIDGT. Bridget. Marcus read aloud, his excitement building. Can you tell us your full name? BRIDGBSHOP. The name sent chills down Marcus's spine. Bridget Bishop was the first person executed during the Salem witch trials, hanged on June 10th, 1692. But she hadn't been buried here. Her body had been thrown into an unmarked grave somewhere else in the town. Bridget Bishop, Marcus breathed. You were wrongly accused. We're here to listen to your story. The temperature plummeted further. Frost began forming on the headstones around them, and Marcus's equipment registered electromagnetic readings off the charts. The planchette moved with violent jerks now. NOTWRONG. What do you mean, not wrong? Marcus asked, confused. The historical records were clear. Bridget Bishop had been innocent, a victim of mass hysteria and false accusations. IWASAWITCH. The admission hung in the air like a death sentence. Marcus felt the blood drain from his face as he realized what he'd done. He hadn't contacted an innocent victim. He'd awakened something that had been rightfully bound for over 3 centuries. TGYKILLEDMYBODYBUTNOTMYPOWER. The candles suddenly blazed higher, their flames turning an unnatural shade of green. The chat was going wild, but Marcus could no longer see the screen clearly. A thick, choking mist had begun to rise from the ground, swirling around the altar like a miniature tornado. What do you want? Marcus stammered, his professional composure cracking. REVNG. The words spelled out slowly, deliberately, as if the spirit was savoring each letter. The mist began to take shape, forming the outline of a woman in colonial dress. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow pits of rage that had festered for centuries. Revenge against whom? Marcus asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. ELLOFTHEMALLWHWLIVINCLEM. The apparition of Bridget Bishop stepped forward, her form becoming more solid with each passing second. Marcus could smell the earth of her grave, the rope that had strangled her, the wood smoke from the fires that had consumed her possessions. But they're all dead, Marcus protested. Everyone from the trials died centuries ago. TGIRBL GODREMINSTHERDSCNDNTSLIV. The horrible truth dawned on Marcus. She wasn't seeking revenge against the long-dead accusers. She wanted to destroy their bloodlines, their families, everyone connected to the town that had murdered her. "I can't let you do that," Marcus said, trying to sound braver than he felt. "Those people are innocent." Innocent. Bridget's laughter echoed through the cemetery like the wail of a banshee. Innocent. The candles exploded in a shower of wax and flame. Marcus's equipment short-circuited, sending sparks flying through the air. The live stream cut to black, just as viewers caught their last glimpse of the ghost hunter's terrified face. In the sudden darkness, Marcus heard footsteps approaching, not the heavy boots of the living, but the shuffling gait of the long dead. He fumbled for his phone's flashlight, but the device wouldn't respond. The electromagnetic energy was too intense. "You freed me," Bridget's voice whispered directly into his ear, though he could see nothing in the absolute blackness. "After 300 years of imprisonment, you gave me the power to walk among the living again." "It was an accident," Marcus pleaded. "I didn't know." "But you did know," she interrupted. "You knew the risks of calling to the dead. You knew that some spirits are bound for good reason, yet you persisted, driven by fame and fortune." The truth of her words cut deep. Marcus had ignored every warning, every safety precaution taught by serious paranormal investigators. He'd been so focused on creating viral content that he'd forgotten the real dangers of his profession. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "You will be my herald," Bridget replied. "You will spread word of my return throughout Salem. You will tell them that their ancestors' sins have come home to roost." "And if I refuse?" Bridget's laughter filled the air again. "Look around you, Marcus Kane. Look at what you've done." Marcus's phone suddenly flickered to life, casting a weak glow across the cemetery. What he saw made his blood turn to ice. The 13 candles had reformed themselves, but now they burned with an eerie blue flame that cast no warmth. The Ouija board had cracked down the middle, releasing something that had been trapped within its wood for generations. But worst of all were the other shapes moving in the darkness. Bridget hadn't come alone. "The board you used," she explained, as if reading his thoughts, "was made from the wood of my gallows. When they destroyed my body, a local carpenter claimed the lumber. His descendant used it to craft that board, unknowingly trapping my spirit within. But boards can be broken, and prisons can be escaped." Marcus counted at least a dozen other figures emerging from mist, men and women in colonial dress, all bearing the marks of violent death. Rope burns around their necks, crushed skulls, bodies bearing the wounds of stones and clubs. "The others who died," Marcus whispered, "you've brought them back too." "Only those who shared my gift," Bridget corrected. "Only those who were truly what they were accused of being. We were the real witches of Salem, Marcus, and now we're free." The temperature dropped so low that Marcus could see his breath crystallizing in the air. Frost spread across the ground like a living thing, killing the grass beneath their feet. In the distance, he could hear dogs howling and car alarms going off as the supernatural energy spread throughout the town. "The people of Salem will pay for their ancestors' crimes," Bridget declared. "Every family line that profited from our deaths, every household that cheered our executions, every bloodline that carries the guilt of our murder, they will all suffer as we suffered." "But there must be hundreds of families," Marcus protested. "Thousands of people who have no idea about their connection to the trials." "Ignorance is no excuse," Bridget replied coldly. "The sins of the fathers shall be visited upon their children unto the 7th generation." Marcus realized with growing horror that he'd unleashed something far beyond his ability to control. This wasn't just a haunting. It was a supernatural war that would tear Salem apart. "There has to be another way," he said desperately. "Some way to undo what I've done." Bridget studied him with those hollow, rage-filled eyes. "You freed us, Marcus Kane. You gave us the power to take our revenge. But power, once given, cannot be easily taken back. But you're asking me to help you murder innocent people." "I'm not asking," Bridget replied. "I'm telling you. You will serve as our herald, or you will join the ranks of our victims. The choice is yours, but choose quickly. Dawn approaches, and we have much work to do." As if summoned by her words, the other spirits began to move. Some headed toward the heart of Salem, their forms flickering between solid and ethereal. Others seemed to dissolve into the mist itself, traveling by means beyond mortal understanding. Marcus watched in horror as the consequences of his actions spread like a plague across the town. He'd wanted to communicate with the dead, but he'd never considered that some of the dead might not want to communicate. They might want to destroy. "Wait," he called out as Bridget began to fade. "What about the live stream? What about the evidence? People saw what happened here. Let them see." Bridget replied with a cruel smile. "Let them know that the witches of Salem have returned. Let them know that the reckoning has begun." And with that, she vanished into the night, leaving Marcus alone among the dying candles and broken equipment. In the distance, he could hear the first screams beginning to rise from the sleeping town. He pulled out his phone and saw that he had 17 missed calls from his producer, 43 text messages from fellow paranormal investigators, and over 10,000 notifications from social media. The live stream had been recorded by dozens of viewers before it cut out, and the footage was already going viral. But Marcus barely noticed any of it. He was too busy staring at the Ouija board, which had reformed itself despite being cracked moments before. A new message was appearing on its surface, letter by letter. THARVSTBYNSATDAWN. Marcus Kane, paranormal investigator and unwitting harbinger of doom, realized that his greatest horror story had only just begun. And this time, he wasn't just telling it, he was living it. The wind picked up again, carrying with it the scent of grave dirt and the sound of approaching sirens. Salem was about to learn that some histories are better left undisturbed, and some spirits are meant to stay dead. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Marcus wondered if he would live to see another Halloween. More importantly, he wondered if anyone in Salem would survive the revenge of Bridget Bishop and her coven of the truly damned. The seance was over, but the nightmare had just begun. The scorching Texas sun was sitting behind the twisted mesquite trees as Jake Martinez pulled his beat-up Honda Civic onto the cracked asphalt road leading to the Devil's Ranch. His camera equipment rattled in the back seat, and his phone showed 3 bars of signal for now. "What's up, nightmare seekers?" Jake spoke into his handheld camera, his voice artificially cheerful despite the growing dread in his stomach. "It's your boy Jake, and tonight we're doing something absolutely insane. I'm about to spend the night at the most cursed location in all of Texas, the abandoned Blackwood Ranch, better known as the Devil's Ranch." The rusted gate hung open like a gaping wound, its metal hinges screaming in protest as Jake pushed through. The ranch stretched across several acres of dead grass and scattered bones, cattle bones, he hoped. In the distance, the skeletal remains of the main house stood silhouetted against the blood-red sky. Jake had done his research. In 1987, the Blackwood family had owned this cattle ranch until they joined something called the Crimson Brotherhood, a satanic cult that had terrorized rural Texas for 3 years. The cult had performed ritualistic sacrifices here, using both animals and, according to unconfirmed reports, human victims. The FBI had raided the property in 1990, but they'd found only charred remains and symbols carved into every surface. "The locals won't even drive past this place," Jay continued, walking toward the house while his camera captured the eerie landscape. "They say you can still hear the screaming at night, and that the devil himself walks these grounds." The front door of the house hung askew, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. Jake's flashlight beam cut through the shadows, illuminating walls covered in bizarre symbols carved deep into the wood. Inverted crosses, pentagrams, and strange hieroglyphic-like markings covered every inch of the interior. "Jesus Christ," Jake whispered, then immediately felt foolish for invoking that name in this place. The house seemed to pulse around him, as if it were alive and breathing. He set up his base camp in what used to be the living room, arranging his cameras to capture every angle. The sun had completely disappeared now, plunging the ranch into absolute darkness. Jake's equipment cast strange shadows on the walls, making the carved symbols seem to writhe and move. At 11:17 p.m., Jake heard the first sound, a low, guttural moaning that seemed to come from beneath the floorboards. He grabbed his camera and followed the sound, his flashlight revealing a trapdoor he hadn't noticed before. The wooden door was marked with a large pentagram burned into its surface. "This is it, guys," Jake whispered to his camera. "This is where they did the rituals." Against every instinct screaming at him to leave, Jake pulled open the trapdoor. A wave of putrid air rushed out, carrying the stench of decay and something else, something that smelled like sulfur and burnt flesh. Stone steps descended into the earth, disappearing into impenetrable darkness. Jake's phone lost signal the moment he stepped underground. The basement was larger than the house itself, with stone walls covered in more elaborate symbols. Rusted chains hung from the ceiling, and dark stains covered the floor in patterns that looked disturbingly intentional. In the center of the room stood an altar made of black stone, its surface stained with what Jake prayed was animal blood. Candles surrounded it, dozens of them, all melted into grotesque shapes. But what made Jake's blood run cold were candles that were still burning, their flames dancing without any wind. "This is impossible," Jake muttered, his voice echoing in the chamber. "No one's been here for decades." That's when he heard the chanting. Low, rhythmic voices speaking in a language Jake didn't recognize filled the air around him. The sound seemed to come from the walls themselves, growing louder and more urgent. Jake spun around, his camera shaking as he tried to locate the source of the voices. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds. Jake's breath began to mist, and frost started forming on the stone walls. The candle flames turned from orange to an unnatural blue, casting everything in an otherworldly glow. "Welcome, child of the light." A voice boomed from everywhere and nowhere. "You have come to witness the truth." Jake's camera flickered and died. In the darkness, he could hear something moving, something large and heavy dragging itself across the stone floor. The chanting grew louder, more frenzied, and Jake realized with horror that the voices weren't coming from the walls. They were coming from below. The floor beneath the altar began to crack and split. A red glow seeped through the fissures, and the temperature shifted from freezing to unbearably hot in seconds. Jake tried to run, but his feet wouldn't move. Something was holding him in place, invisible hands gripping his ankles with crushing force. 35 years we have waited," the voice continued. 35 years since the last offering. You will complete the ritual." The altar began to rise from the floor, revealing a pit underneath, filled with shifting shadows and glimpses of things Jake's mind refused to process. Shapes that weren't quite human, but weren't quite animal writhed in the darkness below. The chanting reached a crescendo, and Jake felt himself being pulled toward the altar. His backup camera, still clipped to his belt, suddenly sparked to life. Through its cracked screen, Jake could see himself being dragged by invisible forces toward the pit. But in the camera's display, he could also see them, the members of the Crimson Brotherhood, their ghostly forms surrounding him, their eyes glowing with unholy fire. "The Devil's Ranch claims another," whispered the cult leader, his spectral form towering over Jake. "Your soul will feed the darkness, and your flesh will sanctify this ground." Jake's screams echoed through the chamber as he was lifted onto the altar. The last thing his camera recorded was the sound of otherworldly laughter and the sight of something rising from the pit, something with too many teeth and eyes like burning coals. The next morning, Jake's car was found abandoned at the ranch gate. His camera equipment was discovered in the house, along with hours of footage that the Texas Rangers immediately classified. The official report stated that Jake Martinez had suffered a psychological break and wandered into the desert, where he presumably died of exposure. But the locals know better. They know that on certain nights, when the moon is dark and the wind carries the scent of sulfur, you can still hear Jake's voice calling out from the Devil's Ranch, not for help, but inviting others to join him in the darkness below. The Crimson Brotherhood still gathers in that basement, their numbers growing with each foolish soul who dares to spend the night at the most cursed ranch in Texas. And somewhere in that pit beneath the altar, Jake Martinez continues his eternal broadcast to an audience of the damned, forever trapped in the Devil's Ranch. The ranch gate swings open on its own now, welcoming new visitors to experience the horror that lurks beneath the Texas soil. Local authorities have given up trying to keep people away. They've learned that some places are beyond human intervention, places where the devil himself has claimed dominion. And every night, the chanting begins anew, calling out across the empty plains of Texas, seeking fresh souls to feed the darkness that dwells beneath the Devil's Ranch. The sun was bleeding across the Arizona sky when Marcus Chin pulled his dusty Jeep to a stop beside the weathered road sign. His camera bag sat heavy in the passenger seat, filled with the expensive equipment that had made him one of the most sought-after landscape photographers in the Southwest. But today wasn't about commissioned work or gallery exhibitions. Today was about the legend. Local ranchers in Phoenix had whispered about it for generations. A ghost town deep in the Sonoran Desert that appeared only to those who weren't looking for it. They called it Agua Perdida, the Lost Water, a settlement that had thrived briefly during the copper boom of the 1880s before vanishing without explanation, leaving behind only foundations and bones. Marcus shouldered his pack and began walking into the desert, following the faint tire tracks that led away from the highway. The October heat was merciless, even at dusk, and sweat beaded on his forehead as he navigated between towering saguaro cacti and clusters of prickly pear. His GPS had lost signal 20 minutes ago, but he pressed on, driven by an inexplicable pull toward the darkening horizon. The first sign something was wrong came when he noticed the silence. No coyotes howling, no insects buzzing, no wind through the desert grass. Even his own footsteps seemed muffled, as if the very air was absorbing sound. The temperature dropped suddenly, impossibly, sending a chill through his sweat-soaked shirt. That's when he saw it. Agua Perdida materialized from the desert like a mirage in reverse, becoming more solid as he approached rather than fading away. Adobe buildings lined a main street that seemed to shimmer with heat despite the cool air. A church bell tower rose against the star-filled sky, its bronze bell catching moonlight. Windows glowed with warm yellow light, and smoke drifted from chimneys. Marcus raised his camera instinctively, but the viewfinder showed only empty desert. He lowered it, and the town reappeared, clearer than before. People moved through the streets, men in suspenders and bowler hats, women in long skirts and bonnets, children chasing each other between buildings. The sound of piano music drifted from what appeared to be a saloon. "Impossible," Marcus whispered, his voice swallowed by the unnatural quiet. A woman emerged from the nearest building, her face pale in the moonlight. She wore a dress that might have been white once, but now appeared gray and water-stained. Her eyes were the color of desert sand, and when she smiled, Marcus saw that her teeth were stained with something dark. "Welcome to Agua Perdida, stranger," she said, her voice carrying an odd echo. "We don't get many visitors anymore." Marcus tried to step backward, but his feet wouldn't obey. The woman approached, her movements too fluid, too graceful. As she drew closer, he noticed that her skin had a translucent quality, like looking through frosted glass. "I'm Sarah Whitmore," she continued, extending a hand that Marcus found himself unable to refuse. Her touch was cold as winter water, and he gasped as images flooded his mind. The town as it had been, bustling with life and hope. Then the drought that lasted 7 years, the wells running dry, the copper mine flooding with groundwater that tasted of salt and death. The terrible choice the townspeople had made when faced with slow starvation. "You drink the water," Marcus said, the words coming from somewhere deep in his throat. Sarah's smile widened. "We had no choice. The mine water was all we had left. We didn't know it was poisoned with arsenic and mercury. We didn't know it would kill us all within a week." More figures emerged from the buildings now, men, women, children, all with that same translucent skin, all moving with that same impossible grace. Their eyes reflected the moonlight like mirrors, and Marcus realized with growing horror that none of them cast shadows. "But we didn't stay dead," Sarah continued conversationally. The water that killed us also bound us here. We've been waiting so long for someone to share our burden." Marcus tried to run, but his body no longer responded to his commands. The ghostly townspeople formed a circle around him, their faces eager and hungry. He could smell the desert earth, the metallic tang of poisoned water, and something else, the sweet, cloying scent of decay. "The water is still here," Sarah said, producing a tin cup from the folds of her dress, "in the old well behind the church. One sip, and you'll understand everything. You'll be part of Agua Perdita forever." The cup was filled with liquid that seemed to move of its own accord, dark and oily in the moonlight. Marcus could see things swimming in it. Not quite insects, not quite worms, but something that should never exist in any natural water source. "Please," Marcus managed to whisper. "I have a family, a life." "So did we," Sarah replied gently. "But the desert takes what it wants, and tonight it wants you." The circle of dead townspeople pressed closer, their hands reaching out to touch him. Each contact sent waves of cold through his body, and Marcus felt his life force being slowly drained away. His vision began to blur, and the world tilted sideways. As consciousness faded, Marcus heard the sound of his camera hitting the ground. The last thing he saw was Sarah Whitmore's face, beautiful and terrible in the moonlight, as she lifted the cup to his lips. The poisoned water tasted like copper and despair. When Marcus Chin opened his eyes, the sun was rising over the Sonoran Desert. He stood in the main street of Agua Perdita, wearing clothes that belonged to another century. His skin had that familiar translucent quality, and his reflection in the window of the old general store showed eyes that reflected light like mirrors. Sarah Whitmore stood beside him, no longer alone in her eternal vigil. The town was more solid now, more real. The addition of a new soul had strengthened their collective hold on the physical world. "Welcome home," Sarah said, her voice warm with satisfaction. "Now we wait for the next one." Marcus tried to scream, but no sound emerged. His camera lay forgotten in the desert sand outside the town's borders, its memory card full of images that would never be developed. In the distance, a coyote howled, and the normal sounds of the desert gradually returned. But within the borders of Agua Perdita, the silence remained absolute, broken only by the soft whisper of wind through empty buildings and the occasional clink of a tin cup being filled from a poisoned well. Years passed, decades. The ghost town waited patiently for its next visitor, growing stronger with each soul it claimed. And in the old cemetery behind the church, a new headstone appeared overnight, bearing the name Marcus Chun and the date of his death, though no one living had been there to carve it. The desert had claimed another victim, and Agua Perdita was no longer quite so lost. On quiet nights, when the wind is still and the moon is dark, travelers on the highway outside Phoenix sometimes report seeing lights in the distance, warm, welcoming lights that seem to beckon them into the Sonoran Desert. Most are wise enough to ignore the call, but some are not, and Agua Perdita is always waiting, patient as the desert itself, ready to offer the thirsty traveler a drink of cool, clear water from its ancient well, water that tastes of copper and despair, water that never lets you leave. The October wind howled through the skeletal branches of Helltown as 4 teenagers approached the crumbling remains of the old Methodist church. Sarah clutched her flashlight tighter, its beam dancing across the weathered tombstones that jutted from the earth like broken teeth. "I still think this is stupid," muttered Jake, kicking at a rusted beer can left by previous explorers. The abandoned town of Boston Township had been calling to thrill seekers for decades, but tonight felt different. The air itself seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. "Don't be such a baby," taunted Marcus, adjusting his phone's camera settings. "We're just making a documentary about Ohio's most haunted places. What's the worst that could happen?" Emma, the quiet one of the group, pointed toward the church's gaping doorway. "Look at that. The door's been ripped off its hinges from the inside." The 4 friends had driven down from Cleveland specifically to explore the legends of Helltown, where the government had supposedly forced out residents in the 1970s to create a national park. But the locals whispered darker stories about why people really left about things that should have stayed buried. As they stepped through the threshold, their flashlights revealed a scene of devastation. Pews lay scattered like matchsticks, and the pulpit stood at an impossible angle, as if something massive had tried to claw its way up from beneath the floorboards. The walls were covered in strange symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the dancing light. "These markings," whispered Sarah, tracing one with her finger. "They're not graffiti. They look burned into the wood." A low rumble echoed from somewhere deep within the church's foundation. The teenagers froze as dust began to rain from the ceiling beams above. "Did you guys hear that?" Emma's voice cracked with fear. Before anyone could answer, the temperature plummeted. Their breath came out in visible puffs as an otherworldly voice began to speak, seeming to emanate from the very walls themselves. "Welcome, children of sin." The voice was deep and resonant, like thunder rolling across the Ohio countryside. It carried the cadence of a preacher, but there was something fundamentally wrong about it, something that made their skin crawl and their hearts race. "Who's there?" Jay called out, his voice breaking. "This isn't funny. I am Reverend Cornelius Blackwood." The voice continued, growing stronger with each word, "and my sermon shall never end." The floorboards beneath their feet began to crack and splinter. Through the gaps, a hellish red glow began to seep upward, illuminating the church in an unholy light. The teenagers backed toward the entrance, but the doorway suddenly slammed shut with a thunderous crash. "Oh God, oh God, oh God," Sarah whimpered, pulling frantically at the door handle. "There's an oh God here." The voice boomed with unholy glee. Only the eternal word of the damned. The broken pulpit began to reassemble itself, the wooden pieces floating through the air and clicking into place with supernatural precision. As the teenagers watched in horror, a figure began to materialize behind it, a tall, gaunt man in a tattered black coat, his eyes glowing like coals in the darkness. Reverend Blackwood's face was a study in decay. His skin hung in gray tatters, and his mouth was filled with broken teeth that clicked together as he spoke. Most terrifying of all were his hands, long, skeletal fingers that ended in blackened nails sharp as razors. "I have been waiting so long for a new congregation," he said, his voice now clearly emanating from a horrific figure. "So very long to continue my work." Emma grabbed Marcus's arm. "We need to get out of here now." But the windows had somehow sealed themselves, and the door remained immovable. They were trapped with this nightmare from Helltown's darkest past. "You see," the demon preacher continued, beginning to pace behind his restored pulpit, "I was beloved by my flock. They hung on my every word, even as I led them deeper into damnation. And when the authorities came to shut down our little church, well, we made sure the sermons would continue forever." The red glow intensified, and the teenagers could see bones scattered beneath the floorboards, human remains that had been there for decades. "What do you want from us?" Marcus managed to ask, his phone shaking in his hands. "Souls," Blackwood replied simply. "I need fresh souls to preach to. The old ones have grown so very quiet over the years." That's when they heard at the sound of whispered prayers coming from beneath the floor. The voices of Blackwood's original congregation, trapped for eternity in his hellish church. Jake noticed something, a small crack in the foundation near the altar. "There," he whispered to the others. "If we can get to that hole, maybe we can escape." But Blackwood had heard him. "Oh, you think you can leave? No one leaves during the sermon. That would be rude." The demon preacher raised his skeletal hands, and the teenagers felt an invisible force pulling them toward the front pews. Their feet scraped against the floor as they fought against the supernatural compulsion. "Now then," Blackwood said, his terrible smile widening, "let's begin with a reading from the Book of Eternal Torment." Sarah felt her phone vibrating in her pocket. Somehow, impossibly, she was getting a signal. With trembling fingers, she managed to dial 911. "911, what's your emergency?" "We're trapped in Helltown," she whispered. "The old church. Something's got us." The line went dead, but Blackwood had heard her, his face contorted with rage. Technology, he spat. The devil's own creation. In my time, we had no need for such blasphemy. The demon preacher raised his hands again, and Sarah's phone burst into flames. But the brief distraction had given Jake the chance he needed. He grabbed a piece of broken wood from the floor and hurled it at one of the sealed windows. The glass shattered with a sound like thunder, and blessed cool air rushed into the church. The red glow flickered, and Blackwood's form seemed to waver. "Run!" Jake shouted. The four teenagers dove through the broken window, cutting themselves on the glass, but not caring. They hit the ground hard and rolled, then scrambled to their feet and ran toward their car. Behind them, Blackwood's voice rose to a shriek of fury. "You cannot escape the word of the Lord." The church began to collapse in on itself, the walls crumbling as the demon preacher's rage consumed the building. But even as they reached their car, they could still hear his voice echoing across the empty landscape of Helltown. "My sermons will find you," he called after them. "No matter where you go, you will hear my words." They drove through the night, not stopping until they reached the safety of Cleveland. But even now, months later, they sometimes wake in the middle of the night to the sound of Reverend Blackwood's voice, still preaching his eternal sermon of damnation. And sometimes, when the wind blows just right through the trees of Ohio, travelers on the back roads near Helltown report hearing the sound of a preacher's voice, calling the faithful to a service that will never end. The church may have fallen, but Cornelius Blackwood's congregation is still growing, and he's always looking for new souls to join his eternal sermon in the darkness of Helltown. Some say that on certain nights, when the moon is dark and the air is still, you can still see the red glow rising from the ruins of that cursed church. And if you listen carefully, you might hear the whispered prayers of the damned, forever trapped in Reverend Blackwood's hellish congregation. The teenagers never returned to Helltown, but Helltown followed them. In their dreams, in their nightmares, in the corner of their eyes where shadows gathered. Because once you've heard the demon preacher's sermon, you become part of his flock forever. And in the abandoned ruins of Boston Township, where the government tried to create a national park, but only succeeded in unleashing something far more terrible, Reverend Cornelius Blackwood still preaches to his congregation of the damned. The echoes of his voice will never fade from Helltown, and neither will the souls of those who were foolish enough to disturb his eternal rest. After all, as the demon preacher always said, the word of the Lord is forever, even if that word comes from the depths of hell itself. The neon lights of Hollywood Boulevard flickered like dying stars as Maya Chen clutched her worn leather portfolio against her chest. Another failed audition, another rejection that felt like a knife twisting in her dreams. At 26, she had been chasing her acting dreams in Los Angeles for 5 years, waitressing at a diner in West Hollywood just to pay rent on her cramped studio apartment. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Audition tomorrow. Paramount Pictures. Ask for director Harrison Vale. Come alone." Maya's heart raced. Paramount Pictures was the big leagues, the kind of opportunity that could change everything. She had never heard of Harrison Vale, but desperation made her ignore the red flags. The next morning, Maya drove through the winding roads of the Hollywood Hills to an address that led her to a massive, abandoned studio complex. The sign read Blackwood Studios, EST 1947. Rust ate at the metal letters, and weeds grew through cracks in the concrete. The place looked like it had been forgotten by time itself. A man in his 50s with hollow eyes and graying hair approached her. "You must be Maya. I'm Harrison Vale. Thank you for coming. Is this really where we're filming?" Maya asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Blackwood Studios has history," Harrison replied, his smile not reaching his eyes. "This is where we shot the original Nightmare on Sunset back in 1952. The film was never released. Strange things happened during production." Maya felt a chill run down her spine, but she needed this job. "What kind of strange things?" The lead actress, Catherine Morrison, disappeared during filming. They found her costume in her dressing room, but she was never seen again. Some say she's still here, trapped in the walls of this place. As they walked through the crumbling studio, Maya noticed something odd. The script pages Harrison handed her seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. The story was about a young actress who gets trapped in a haunted film studio, pursued by the ghost of a former star who died during production. This is exactly like my recurring nightmare," Maya whispered, her hands trembling as she read the dialogue. Harrison's eyes gleamed. "Art imitates life, doesn't it? Or perhaps life imitates art. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference." That night, Maya couldn't sleep. The script lay open on her bedside table, and she swore she could hear whispers coming from the pages. In her dreams, she walked through endless corridors of Blackwood Studios, calling out for help while footsteps echoed behind her. The next day, filming began. The crew was smaller than Maya expected. Just Harrison, a cameraman named Eddie, and a sound technician called Mike. They set up in Stage 7, a cavernous space with peeling paint and broken lights hanging from the ceiling like dead spiders. "Action," Harrison called out. Maya began her first scene, but something felt wrong. The words coming out of her mouth weren't from the script. They were from her nightmares. She tried to stop speaking, but the words kept flowing as if someone else was controlling her voice. "I can't leave," she heard herself say. "She won't let me leave. Catherine is still here, and she wants someone to take her place." "Cut," Harrison yelled, but Maya couldn't stop. The studio around her began to shift and change. The walls grew darker, and shadows moved independently of their sources. Eddie lowered his camera, his face pale. "Boss, something's not right here. The film, it's showing things that aren't there." Maya looked at the monitor and gasped. On the screen, she could see herself, but standing behind her was a translucent figure in a 1950s dress. Catherine Morrison, the actress who had disappeared 70 years ago. "She's been waiting," Harrison whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of fear and fascination. "All these years, she's been waiting for someone to complete her story." The temperature in the studio plummeted. Maya's breath became visible in the sudden cold, and the lights began to flicker violently. The script pages scattered across the floor, rearranging themselves into new configurations. "We need to get out of here," Mike said, backing toward the exit. But when he reached the door, it slammed shut with a sound like thunder. Maya felt an invisible hand grab her shoulder. When she turned around, Catherine Morrison stood directly behind her, her eyes hollow and her skin the color of old parchment. "You have to finish the film," Catherine whispered, her voice like wind through dry leaves. "You have to take my place so I can rest." "I won't," Maya said, finding her courage. "I won't be trapped here like you were." Catherine's face contorted with rage. "Then you'll die here, just like I did. Just like all the others who tried to leave." The studio began to shake. Equipment crashed to the floor, and the walls seemed to breathe like living things. Maya realized that her nightmares had been warnings. Catherine had been reaching out to her, preparing her for this moment. "The script," Maya said suddenly. "It's not just a story. It's a trap." She grabbed the scattered pages and saw that they were written in different handwritings, dozens of them. Each page contained the final words of actresses who had been lured to Blackwood Studios over the decades. Harrison laughed, but it was a hollow, desperate sound. "You think I'm in control here? I'm just another prisoner. Catherine chooses the actresses, and I bring them here. I've been doing this for 20 years, hoping that someday she'll let me go." Catherine's ghostly form began to solidify, becoming more real and more terrifying. "Choose," she hissed. "Stay and become part of the film forever, or refuse and join me in death." Maya looked at the script in her hands. The final scene was still unwritten, waiting for her to complete it. She had a choice to make: accept her fate or find another way. "There's a third option," Maya said, her voice growing stronger. "What if I help you finish your story? What if I help you find peace instead of becoming your replacement?" Catherine hesitated, confusion flickering across her spectral features. Maya began to speak, not from the script, but from her heart. "You were an actress once, just like me. You had dreams, hopes, a life you wanted to live. You don't have to be trapped here. You can let go. The studio grew quiet. The shaking stopped, and the oppressive atmosphere began to lift slightly. I was so young, Catherine whispered, tears of light flowing down her translucent cheeks. I just wanted to be remembered. I wanted my story to matter. Your story does matter, Maya said gently, but it doesn't have to end with someone else's suffering. You can choose to let go, to find peace. You can choose to be free. Catherine looked at Maya for a long moment, then at Harrison, Eddie, and Mike. I've been so angry for so long. I forgot what it felt like to hope. The ghostly actress began to fade, but this time it was different. Instead of the violent, desperate clinging to the physical world, she was choosing to leave. The studio around them began to brighten, and the oppressive weight that had pressed down on them lifted. Thank you, Catherine whispered as she disappeared entirely. Thank you for helping me remember who I was. The doors of Stage 7 swung open, and natural light flooded in. The script pages crumbled to dust, and the camera equipment that had been filming everything went silent. Maya walked out of Blackwood Studios that day, forever changed by her experience. She never became a famous actress, but she found something more valuable, the courage to help others find their own peace. Harrison Vale was found 3 days later, sitting peacefully in his office at the studio. He had passed away in his sleep, finally free from the curse that had bound him to Catherine's story. Blackwood Studios was demolished 6 months later, and a memorial park was built in its place. A small plaque honors Catherine Morrison and all the other dreamers who came to Hollywood seeking their fortunes. Maya still lives in Los Angeles, but now she works as a counselor, helping other struggling actors navigate the dark side of the entertainment industry. Sometimes, late at night, she swears she can still hear Catherine's voice on the wind, whispering words of gratitude and peace. The film that was shot in Blackwood Studios was never completed, but Maya kept one thing from that terrifying day: the knowledge that sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that teach us how to let go. And in the Hollywood Hills, where dreams are born and sometimes die, the ghost of Catherine Morrison finally rests in peace, her story complete at last. The end came not with screams or violence, but with understanding and compassion, proving that even in the darkest places, there's always a choice between fear and love, between holding on and letting go. Maya's own nightmare had ended, but her real life, her meaningful life, had just begun. The fog rolled across Lake Superior like a living thing, thick and cold, swallowing the morning light whole. Captain Jake Morrison had been fishing these waters for 37 years, but he'd never seen anything quite like this. The mist seemed to whisper as it moved, carrying sounds that shouldn't exist in the empty expanse of water. "You hear that, Cap?" his deckhand Tommy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The young man's face had gone pale beneath his weather-beaten cap. Jake strained his ears against the silence. Then he heard it too, a low, melodic humming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The sound was beautiful, almost hypnotic, like voices calling from beneath the waves. "Probably just the wind," Jake muttered, but his grip tightened on the wheel. In all his years on Lake Superior, he'd learned to trust his instincts, and right now they were screaming at him to turn back. The singing grew louder as they drifted deeper into the fog. It was definitely voices now, multiple voices harmonizing in a language that predated any human tongue. The melody was ancient, primal, and it made Jake's skin crawl with recognition he couldn't explain. Tommy stumbled backward, his eyes wide with terror. "Cap, we need to get out of here. Something's not right." But Jake found himself unable to move. The singing had wrapped around his mind like chains, beautiful and terrible. He could see shapes moving beneath the water now, dark, serpentine forms that glided through the depths with impossible grace. The first body surfaced 20 yards from their boat. It was Bill Henderson, who'd gone missing 3 days ago along with his entire crew. But Bill wasn't floating. He was being held up by something beneath the water, something with long, webbed fingers that pressed against his bloated chest. His mouth hung open, and impossibly, horribly, the singing was coming from his throat. "Mother of God, Tommy screamed, but his voice was lost in the growing chorus. More bodies began to surface around them. Fishermen who'd vanished over the past month, all held aloft by the same impossible hands, all singing in that ancient, terrible harmony. Their eyes were gone, replaced by hollow sockets that wept lake water. Their skin had turned the color of deep water, blue-black and translucent. Jake tried to start the engine, but his hands wouldn't obey. The singing had infected his very soul, and he could feel something stirring in the depths beneath their boat. The water began to churn, and through the foam, he glimpsed something that made his sanity crack like thin ice. They were beautiful and monstrous, the sirens of Lake Superior. Their bodies were like nothing that should exist in fresh water, scaled and sinuous, with faces that were almost human but stretched and changed by centuries underwater. Their eyes were the deep blue-black of the lake's deepest trenches, and their mouths opened impossibly wide to release that haunting melody. The old stories, Jake whispered, remembering tales his grandfather had told him about the Native American legends of water spirits that lived in the Great Lakes. The Meme-Gwashi. They're real. The largest of the creatures surfaced beside their boat, its massive form dwarfing their fishing vessel. When it spoke, its voice was like the sound of drowning, but somehow Jake understood every word. "You have taken from our waters for too long," it said, its ancient voice mixing with the singing of the possessed dead. "Now you must join our chorus." Webbed hands reached up from the depths, grasping at the sides of the boat. The possessed fishermen began to swim closer, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes controlled by an unseen puppeteer. Tommy broke free from the spell first, scrambling toward the emergency flare gun. "Not today, you ugly bastards," he shouted, firing a flare directly at the nearest siren. The creature shrieked, a sound like breaking glass mixed with the cry of a dying whale. The flare struck its scaled chest, and for a moment, the singing stopped. The spell broken, Jake lunged for the engine controls. The motor roared to life, and Jake spun the wheel hard to port. But the sirens weren't finished with them. The water around the boat began to rise, forming impossible walls of liquid that defied gravity. The possessed fishermen dove beneath the surface, and Jake could see them swimming alongside the boat with inhuman speed. "They're hurting us," Jake realized with growing horror, driving us toward the deep water. The fog began to clear, revealing the true scope of their nightmare. Lake Superior stretched endlessly in all directions, but the water had changed. Instead of the familiar blue-green of the Great Lake, it was now deep black, like looking into an abyss. And rising from those depths were hundreds of the creatures, their singing growing louder with each passing moment. Tommy fired another flare, then another, but there were too many of them. The sirens surrounded the boat in a perfect circle, their ancient song filling the air with promises of peace beneath the waves. Jake felt his was slipping away again. The singing was inside his head now, showing him visions of the deep places, where the water was warm and the pressure would crush his bones to powder in seconds. It would be peaceful, the voices promised. No more struggling against the storms. No more watching the lake claim other men's boats. Just eternal rest in the depths. "Cap, don't listen to them." Tommy's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Remember Sarah. Remember your kids." The mention of his family cut through the spell like a knife. Jake's daughter Sarah, only 16, with her mother's eyes and her father's love of the water. She was waiting for him at home, probably making dinner and wondering why he was late. With a surge of desperate strength, Jake grabbed the radio and cranked it to full volume. Static filled the air, breaking the perfect harmony of the siren's song. The creatures recoiled, their melody faltering. "This is the Mary Catherine," Jake shouted into the microphone. "Mayday, mayday. Position approximately 15 miles northeast of Grand Portage. Under attack by unknown entities. Require immediate assistance." Static seemed to burn the sirens like acid. Several of them dove beneath the surface, their forms dissolving into the black water. But the largest one, the ancient one that had spoken to them, remained, its eyes fixed on Jake with hatred older than human civilization. "You cannot run from us forever," it said. its voice now barely above a whisper. "We know you're sent now. We know your blood. When you return to our waters, we will be waiting." The creature sank slowly beneath the surface, its massive form disappearing into the depths. The possessed fishermen followed, their borrowed voices joining in one final, mournful note before they too vanished into the black. The fog lifted suddenly, revealing the familiar blue waters of Lake Superior. Their boat was exactly where it should be, 15 miles from shore, with the Minnesota coastline visible in the distance. Tommy was shaking violently, his face white as sea foam. "Did that really happen, Cap? Or are we losing our minds?" Jake looked at the radio, still crackling with static. Then he looked at the empty flare gun in Tommy's hands. Finally, he looked at the deck of their boat, where small puddles of black water were slowly evaporating in the morning sun. "It happened," he said quietly. "God help us, it happened." They made it back to Grand Portage in record time, neither man speaking during the journey. When they reached the dock, Jake immediately called the Coast Guard to report the missing fishermen, though he kept the details of their encounter deliberately vague. That night, alone in his cabin, Jake researched the old legends of Lake Superior. The Ojibwe people had stories going back centuries about the Mamegwashi, water spirits that lived in the deepest parts of the Great Lakes. They were said to be guardians of the water, punishing those who took too much or showed disrespect to the lake's power. As he read, Jake began to understand the true horror of what they'd experienced. The sirens weren't just ancient spirits. They were the collective rage of Lake Superior itself, awakened by decades of overfishing and pollution. They were taking their revenge one boat at a time, adding each crew to their chorus of the damned. The next morning brought news that chilled Jake to his core. 3 more fishing boats had gone missing during the night, all in the same area where they'd encountered the sirens. The Coast Guard had found only debris and oil slicks, but Jake knew the truth. Somewhere in the depths of Lake Superior, 37 more voices had joined the ancient song, and the sirens were growing stronger. He never went back to those waters. Within a week, he'd sold his boat and moved his family to Arizona, as far from the Great Lakes as he could get. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind was still, he could swear he heard that terrible singing carried on the air. The Lake Superior sirens were patient. They had waited centuries for their revenge, and they could wait centuries more. But they would never forget the scent of those who had escaped their grasp. And in the deepest trenches of the Great Lake, where the water was black as night and cold as death, the chorus of the damned continued their eternal song, waiting for the day when all who had wronged the waters would join them in their watery grave. The lake remembers everything. The lake forgives nothing. And the sirens are always listening. The August heat in Florida was suffocating as the paranormal investigation team pulled up to the rusted gates of Sunshine State Prison. The abandoned facility had been closed for over a decade, but the stories that emerged from its death row wing still sent chills down the spines of locals in the small town of Cedar Grove. Dr. Sarah Chun, lead investigator of the Atlantic Paranormal Society, stepped out of the van and surveyed the imposing concrete structure. The prison walls rose like tombstones against the darkening sky, their weathered surfaces stained with years of neglect and something else she couldn't quite identify. "This place gives me the creeps already," muttered Jake Morrison, team's tech specialist, as he unloaded equipment from the vehicle. His EMF detector was already buzzing erratically, even though they hadn't entered the building yet. "Save your energy," replied Marcus Thompson, their medium. "We're going to need it tonight." Marcus had been unusually quiet during the drive from Miami, his face pale and drawn. He claimed he could already feel the presence of something malevolent waiting inside. The 4th member of their team, Rebecca Walsh, was busy setting up cameras around the perimeter. As their historian and researcher, she had spent weeks diving into the prison's dark past. What she had discovered made her question whether they should be here at all. "Listen up, everyone," Dr. Chin called out, gathering the team near the main entrance. According to Rebecca's research, between 1985 and 2010, 17 inmates on death row reported being tormented by what they called the shadow people. These weren't isolated incidents spread over years. They all happened in the final weeks before their executions. Rebecca pulled out a worn folder filled with prison records and newspaper clippings. The reports were remarkably consistent. Inmates described tall, humanoid figures made of pure darkness that would appear in their cells during the night. These shadows would whisper things to them, terrible things about their past crimes and the victims they had hurt. What kind of things? Jake asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. According to the prison psychologist's notes, the inmates claimed the shadows knew details about their crimes that had never been made public. They would recreate the murders in the cells, forcing the inmates to relive their victims' final moments over and over again. Marcus shuddered. That's not typical paranormal activity. This sounds like something far more sinister. Dr. Chin nodded grimly. 3 of the inmates actually requested to have their executions moved up because they couldn't stand the nightly torment anymore. 2 others committed suicide in their cells rather than face another night with the shadows. As they approached the main entrance, the heavy metal door creaked open with surprising ease. The sound echoed through the empty corridors beyond, as if the building itself was inviting them inside. The power was cut years ago, Rebecca noted, but Jake's brought portable generators for our equipment. They made their way through the administrative wing, their flashlights cutting through the oppressive darkness. The air was thick with the smell of mold and decay, but underneath it lurked something else, something that reminded Dr. Chun of hospitals and morgues. The death row wing is in the eastern section, Rebecca said, consulting her map. We'll need to pass through the general population area first. As they walked deeper into the prison, their footsteps echoed off the concrete walls. Cell doors hung open like gaping mouths, and graffiti covered the walls, some left by inmates, others by urban explorers who had ventured inside over the years. Wait. Marcus suddenly stopped, his hand pressed against his temple. Do you hear that? The team fell silent, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing but the sound of their own breathing and the distant dripping of water somewhere in the darkness. Then, faintly, they heard it, a low, rhythmic tapping, like someone hitting metal against concrete. It's coming from ahead, Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. They continued forward, following the sound deeper into the prison. The tapping grew louder and more urgent, accompanied now by what sounded like muffled voices. But as they rounded a corner, the sound suddenly stopped. This is it, Rebecca announced as they reached a heavy steel door marked with a sign reading, "Authorized personnel only, death row wing." Dr. Chun tried the handle. The door was unlocked, swinging open with a groan that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. Beyond lay a narrow corridor lined with individual cells, each one secured with reinforced steel bars. According to the records, most of the shadow encounters occurred in cells 7 through 12, Rebecca said, her voice echoing in the confined space. They set up their base camp in the corridor, Jake arranging cameras and audio equipment while Dr. Chun prepared her investigation tools. Marcus sat quietly in a corner, his eyes closed in concentration. "I can feel them," he said suddenly. "They're here. They've been waiting." As if responding to his words, the temperature in the corridor dropped noticeably. Their breath began to fog in the suddenly frigid air. "Cell 9, Marcus continued, his voice taking on a strange, distant quality. "That's where it's strongest. That's where Thomas Wright spent his final days." Rebecca quickly flipped through her files. Thomas Wright, convicted of murdering 3 children in Jacksonville in 1987. He was executed in 1989, but according to the prison logs, he spent his final month claiming that the shadows were forcing him to relive his crimes every night. A loud clang echoed through the corridor, the sound of metal hitting metal. They all turned toward Cell 9, where the door had somehow swung shut. "That door was open when we got here," Jake said, his voice shaking. "I'm sure of it." Dr. Chen approached the cell cautiously, her EMF detector screaming as she got closer. Through the bars, she could see the small, cramped space where Thomas Wright had spent his final days. The walls were covered in scratches and what looked like desperate claw marks. He tried to dig his way out. she observed. "Look at the marks on the walls." He scraped his fingers bloody, trying to escape. Suddenly, the lights on all their equipment began to flicker. The cameras Jake had set up started recording on their own, and the audio equipment picked up a low, menacing whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Can you make out what it's saying?" Dr. Chen asked Jake, who was frantically adjusting the audio levels. It's reciting names," Jake replied, his face pale. "The names of victims. But not just Wright's victims. I'm hearing other names too, dozens of them." Marcus suddenly stood up, his eyes wide with terror. "They're not just showing the inmates their crimes. They're showing them all the crimes. Every murder, every victim who died within these walls. The shadows feed on guilt and suffering." The whispering grew louder, more insistent. Now they could all hear it clearly. A chorus of voices reciting an endless litany of names, dates, and horrific details. "We need to get out of here," Rebecca said, backing toward the exit. "This isn't a normal haunting. These entities are malevolent." But as they turned to leave, they found their way blocked. The corridor behind them was filled with dark, towering figures, the shadow people the inmates had described. They moved with impossible fluidity, their forms shifting and writhing like living smoke. "They don't want us to leave," Marcus whispered. "They want us to stay. They want us to become part of their collection." The shadows began to advance, and as they did, the team was suddenly overwhelmed by visions, flashes of murders, scenes of violence and cruelty that had occurred both inside and outside the prison walls. They saw through the eyes of killers and victims alike, experiencing every moment of terror and pain. Dr. Chen fought against the visions, forcing herself to think clearly. "The executions," she gasped. "The shadows appeared only to inmates who were about to be executed. They feed on impending death." "But we're not condemned," Jake protested, even as the shadows pressed closer. "No," Dr. Chen realized with growing horror, "but we're trapped here with them, and they have all the time in the world to make us suffer." The shadows reached out with what might have been arms or tendrils, and where they touched, the team felt their memories being invaded, their worst moments of guilt and regret brought to the surface and amplified. Marcus screamed as he relived every mistake he had ever made, every person he had hurt or failed to help. Rebecca found herself drowning in visions of historical tragedies she had studied, forced to experience them as if she had been there. Jake was overwhelmed by the deaths of family members, replaying their final moments over and over again. Dr. Chen struggled to maintain her composure, but even she was beginning to crack under the psychological assault. The shadow seemed to know exactly which emotional wounds to probe, which memories would cause the most pain. "The execution chamber," she managed to say through gritted teeth. "If they're connected to the executions, maybe that's where we can find a way to stop them." Fighting against the crushing weight of the visions, she forced herself to move toward the far end of the corridor. The shadows followed, their whispers growing more frantic and angry. The execution chamber was a small, sterile room containing the electric chair where dozens of condemned inmates had met their end. But as Dr. Chen entered, she realized that the chair itself was not the source of the supernatural activity. Carved into the floor around the chair was a complex pattern of symbols and markings, barely visible beneath years of dirt and neglect. The markings seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and she realized that someone had deliberately created this spiritual trap. "It's a summoning circle," she breathed. "Someone called these entities here intentionally." Rebecca, despite her terror, managed to focus on the symbols. "These aren't random occult markings. They're designed to bind spirits to this place, to feed off the final moments of the condemned." "Who would do such a thing?" Jake asked, his voice hoarse from screaming. "Someone who wanted to ensure that justice was served beyond the grave," Marcus replied, his psychic abilities allowing him to sense the truth. "The warden, Harold Blackwood. He lost his own daughter to a murder that went unsolved. He wanted to make sure that every killer who passed through these walls experienced the same terror their victims felt." Dr. Chen knelt beside the summoning circle, studying the symbols more closely. "If we can break the circle, we might be able to weaken their hold on this place." But as she reached for the carved markings, the shadows let out a collective shriek that seemed to shake the very foundations of the prison. They surged forward, more solid and threatening than before. "They won't let us destroy it," Marcus warned. "It's the source of their power." Dr. Chen had an idea. "We don't need to destroy it. We need to redirect it. These entities feed on guilt and suffering, right? But what if we could turn that energy back on them?" She pulled out a piece of chalk from her investigation kit and began to modify the symbols, creating a mirror pattern that would reverse the flow of spiritual energy. The shadows pressed closer, their whispers becoming desperate pleas and threats. "Help me," she called to her team. "We need to focus on their guilt, their responsibility for tormenting innocent people." Together, they began to concentrate on the suffering the shadows had caused, the inmates they had driven to suicide, the families who had never found peace because their loved ones' final days had been filled with supernatural torment. The modified summoning circle began to glow with a different kind of energy. The shadows writhed and twisted, their forms becoming less solid as the spiritual trap turned against them. "It's working," Rebecca gasped. "They're being pulled back to wherever they came from." But Harold Blackwood's spirit was not ready to give up so easily. The former warden materialized in the execution chamber, his ghostly form crackling with rage and determination. "You don't understand," he snarled, his voice echoing with supernatural power. "These monsters deserve to suffer. They killed innocent people. They destroyed families. They paid for their crimes." Dr. Chen interrupted, standing her ground despite the terrifying apparition before her. "You turn justice into revenge, and revenge into endless torture. That's not justice. That's just cruelty." Blackwood's form flickered, his certainty wavering. "My daughter. She was only 7 years old. Her killer was never caught. He's still out there, free while she's... And tormenting other killers won't bring her back," Marcus said gently. "It won't give her peace. It won't give you peace." The modified summoning circle pulsed brighter, and the shadows began to fade. Blackwood looked around desperately, realizing that his supernatural revenge was coming to an end. "Please," he whispered, "don't let them escape justice." "Justice has already been served," Dr. Chen replied. "These men were executed for their crimes. What you've done here goes beyond justice. It's torture, and it needs to end." With a final, anguished cry, Harold Blackwood's spirit dissipated, and the shadows vanished with him. The oppressive atmosphere in the prison lifted, and the team found themselves alone in the suddenly quiet execution chamber. They made their way out of Sunshine State Prison in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what they had witnessed. The experience had shaken them all, forcing them to confront difficult questions about justice, revenge, and the nature of evil itself. As they drove away from the abandoned facility, Dr. Chen looked back at the imposing structure one final time. The prison still looked forbidding in the darkness, but she could sense that the malevolent presence that had haunted its halls for so long was finally gone. "Do you think we did the right thing?" Rebecca asked quietly. "Those inmates really were killers. Maybe they deserved what they got." Dr. Chun considered the question carefully. Justice is about punishment that fits the crime and serves society. What was happening in that prison wasn't justice. It was endless torture that served no purpose except to satisfy one man's thirst for revenge. "And now," Jake asked. "Now the dead can rest," Marcus replied. "All of them. The killers, their victims, and Harold Blackwood's daughter. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is let the dead finally find peace." As they drove through the Florida night, heading back toward civilization, none of them spoke about the visions they had experienced or the guilt the shadows had forced them to confront. Some things were too personal, too painful to share, even with close colleagues. But they all knew that their investigation of Sunshine State Prison had changed them. They had seen what happened when justice became twisted into something dark and vengeful, and they had learned that sometimes the most important thing paranormal investigators could do was not to prove the existence of ghosts, but to help them find the peace they needed to move on. The abandoned prison stood empty now, its corridors silent, and its cells vacant. The shadow people were gone, banished to whatever realm they had come from. And somewhere in the darkness, the spirits of the executed inmates, their victims, and a grief-stricken father who had lost his way were finally free to rest. But in the small town of Cedar Grove, people still avoid driving past the old prison at night, because even though the shadows are gone, the memory of what happened there lingers. And sometimes, late at night, locals claim they can still hear the faint sound of tapping echoing from the abandoned death row wing, not the desperate tapping of tormented souls, but the gentle tapping of spirits finally at peace, letting the world know that justice, real justice, has finally been served. The Atlantic Paranormal Society never returned to Sunshine State Prison. Their investigation had been successful, but the cost had been high. They had all been forced to confront their own capacity for both good and evil, and the experience had left them changed. Dr. Chin continued her work as a paranormal investigator, but she approached each case with a new understanding of the complexity of supernatural phenomena. Not all ghosts were malevolent, and not all hauntings were straightforward. Sometimes the most important thing was not to banish the spirits, but to understand why they remained and help them find the peace they sought. The abandoned prison in Florida would eventually be demolished, its dark history buried beneath a new housing development. But those who knew the true story of Sunshine State Prison would always remember the lesson it taught, that justice without mercy becomes vengeance, and vengeance without end becomes a prison of its own, one that traps not only the guilty, but the innocent as well. In the end, the haunting of Sunshine State Prison had been about more than just supernatural phenomena. It had been about the human capacity for both cruelty and compassion, about the thin line between justice and revenge, and about the importance of knowing when to let go of the past and allow the dead to rest. The investigation was over, but its impact would be felt for years to come, and in the files of the Atlantic Paranormal Society, the case would be marked as one of their most successful interventions, not because they had captured evidence of the supernatural, but because they had helped lost souls find their way home. This story was inspired by the real-world debate over capital punishment and the psychological effects of death row confinement. While Sunshine State Prison is fictional, the questions it raises about justice, revenge, and the treatment of condemned inmates are very real and continue to be debated today.